When his mother was pregnant, she had no idea she would soon be giving birth to a child who would be so different from others. Jackson was born on a cold winter night. At first, he looked like any other baby. However, as years passed, his parents started noticing his strange behavior. Jackson was a child who preferred to be left alone most of the time. Soon, the angry outbursts began. Jackson's father mainly worked from morning until evening, so he spent time with his mom. She tried very hard to understand her son and to engage him in conversations. One day, she received a phone call from the daycare. The teacher on the other side of the line was distraught. Jackson's mom rushed to the daycare, where she found her son sitting outside the playroom. He was sitting there quietly. When Jackson's father came home that day, he found his wife sitting in the living room, crying. He had no idea what was going on. When he entered the living room, he also noticed 2 suitcases. She looked at him and told him she could not take it anymore. Earlier that day, Jackson fought with another boy over a blue crayon. He pushed the boy, who fell and hit his head hard. The boy had to be taken to the hospital. She told her husband that she tried to talk to their son about the event, but when they got home, he went into his room and refused to speak to her. She got sad and started crying, expecting her son to come over to her and try to comfort her. Instead, he just sat on his bed with a scary stare. "There is something very wrong with our son. Maybe you do not realize that, but I do. He does not talk, he has no friends, has no feelings, and gets easily violent. And I am done. I wish the situation were different, but I cannot take it anymore. Take care of yourself and take care of the boy. Goodbye." He could not believe what had just happened. Did his wife leave him? Did she leave their son? There was nothing wrong with him. He was just different. However, Jackson's dad soon realized that his son needed help. With his mom being gone, Jackson became even more distant. Therefore, his father decided to take him to the doctor. Even at the doctor's office, Jackson refused to cooperate. He did not talk to the doctor, and he did not follow any directions. The doctor was troubled. He had suspicions, but he had to order blood work to confirm the diagnosis. After 2 weeks of waiting, Jackson's father received a phone call from the doctor's office. He was asked to come there tomorrow. "We are very sorry, sir, but your son has Asperger's syndrome," the doctor said quietly. Jackson's father was lost. He had no idea what that meant. The doctor saw the confusion on this man's face, so he told him a bit about the illness. When Jackson's father heard everything the doctor said, he realized that his boy had most of the symptoms of this illness. However, he never thought that his son was seriously wrong. In his eyes, he was just a special little boy. Years went by, and Jackson grew up. He successfully finished school and was now working as an accountant at the IRS. After they received the diagnosis, his father was even more determined to be there for his son. After all, his boy had already lost a mother. Jackson missed her every day, and he was hoping that maybe one day he would see her again. He hoped that if that day came, she would be very proud of him and everything he had achieved in his life. Being very successful at his job and having a great relationship with his father made Jackson very happy. He still lived at home, mostly because he was afraid to leave his dad alone. After all, he was always by his side and made any sacrifices to make Jackson the man he is today. Also, he was afraid to live alone. His father was the light of his life. He always put Jackson first and allowed him to live his life to the fullest. As Jackson grew older, he realized that many things in his life were made possible because of his father. For a long time, he blamed himself for his mother leaving him. He knew that he was different and that raising him was quite a challenge. However, he concluded that anything would be possible if his mother loved him enough. It was tough back then, and Jackson's father was exhausted. He was thinking about stopping his search for a doctor who could help his son. Then he remembered something that his mother always used to say. She said that often the solution comes when you are just about to give up. Therefore, he decided to give it one more try. And it was good that he did. When they met Dr. Wilson, Jackson's father felt hope for the first time in a while. Jackson got new medicine and was visiting Dr. Wilson 3 times a week. He liked his new doctor and their therapy sessions. They were different from all the sessions he had had before. After a while, Jackson's father began noticing changes in his son's behavior. He looked happier, and he started talking to him more. He seemed calmer and more confident. His father was delighted and proud. After a few years, Jackson finished school and got his first job, which was also his current job. Even though he was different, his coworkers liked him. Jackson was exceeding expectations at work. He loved working with numbers, and this was his dream job. When he was offered a promotion, Jackson turned it down. He was not a fan of changes, and he liked his current position. Still, even though things were going pretty well in his life, and he had a very loving father, Jackson always felt like something was missing. He felt emptiness. He never wanted to say that aloud, especially not to his father, but he missed his mother deeply. He had a few relationships over the years, however, he never truly fell in love. Dating and meeting women became stressful for him, so he decided he was better off alone. It was not that he was incapable of love, he just assumed that when the time was right, he would meet the right girl. Jackson loved Friday evenings. While most of his coworkers spent the night at different bars with friends, Jackson and his dad had their special movie night. Jackson would choose the movie each Friday, and his dad would make the dinner. After dinner, they would sit on the couch and watch a movie or two together. It was their tradition for years and gave Jackson some sense of stability. Something was different this Friday. His dad was quieter than usual. Jackson could see that his father had trouble slicing vegetables. He came closer to his dad and touched his hand. His dad looked at him and smiled. His son came a long way, and he was grateful for that. Years ago, Jackson lived in his world. He did not want to talk, did not want to be touched, and it looked like he could never feel empathy. However, it was Dr. Wilson who helped them tremendously. Feeling worried about his dad, Jackson offered to finish slicing the vegetables. However, his father waved his hand, shook his head, and told his son that he was okay. Jackson was not convinced, but he decided to leave it alone for now. His world changed upside down during dinner. They had a lovely meal, talked, and had a good time. Suddenly, his father started slurring words, and he collapsed. Jackson was in shock. When they got to the hospital, his father's heart stopped twice. The doctors rushed him into the operating room, and Jackson was alone. After a while, a nurse approached him and showed him to the waiting room. The minutes dragged on like hours, and Jackson could feel his whole body shaking. "We are very sorry for your loss," said the doctor when he finally came out of the operating room. Jackson found out that his father had suffered a heart attack, and the doctors did everything they could, but they could not save his father's life. After losing his mom years ago, he now lost his father too. Jackson was all alone now. It was raining on the day of the funeral. Jackson kept thinking it looked like the sky was also crying for his father. The house was quiet and empty. Jackson kept trying to tie his tie, but he could not do it. His dad always tied for him. Angrily, Jackson threw the link on the bed and left the room. Everything his father did was for him, for his son, his only son. Now he is gone, and Jackson feels lost. The service was beautiful. Many people came to pay their respects, and Jackson did not feel so alone for the first time since his father died. People came up to him when the service was over and expressed their condolences. Most of them knew that Jackson did not like to be touched, so they did not even try to shake his hand. Soon Jackson was the only one left by the grave. He was silent for a while when he realized that there was someone else there. He thought he was dreaming when he turned around and saw a familiar face. Jackson pinched himself twice before realizing it was his mother standing there. His legs suddenly felt heavy, and he could not take a step even though he wanted to. Jackson was standing there in disbelief. His mom was here after all this time. She slowly started to approach him. "Hello, Jackson. Do you remember me?" she asked. Of course he remembers. How could he forget that face? For the first few years of his life, this was the face he saw the most. "What are you doing here, after all this time?" Jackson asked. His mom told him what happened the night she left. She told him what happened at daycare that day. However, she knew that there was no excuse for leaving her son. Jackson told her he already knew everything she told him because his dad never kept anything from him. His mom told him that she had heard about his father's passing, so she wanted to come and pay her respects. She was hoping to see Jackson because she wanted to apologize. She was longing for her son's forgiveness. Jackson thought about this moment for a very long time. He often dreamed and imagined what his reunion with his mother would look like. It took some time, but eventually he stopped blaming himself for her leaving. "I forgave you a long time ago, Mom. I carried the guilt and blame with me for too long. Dad taught me many things, but the most important lesson he taught me was forgiving people for their mistakes. I'm just sad that it took you so long to reach out," Jackson said with tears in his eyes. His mom could not believe her eyes when she saw her son crying. The last time she saw him, he showed no signs of empathy, and there he was now, crying. Her heart was remorseful when she asked her son if she could hug him. "Of course you can. You are my mother after all," Jackson replied, bursting into even more tears as he felt his mother in his arms again. He did not have to imagine their reunion and dream about her anymore. His mother was finally here. Mr. Bentley was an older man in his 50s who lived on the streets of Toronto. He was a natural blonde, but his hair looked different and had more of a dirty brown color because he looked unkempt. His trousers and coats were very old, and they had a lot of patches, and since he could not afford new ones, he used different colors of fabrics to stitch up the torn-out parts. He also had a weird look on his face whenever he smiled. The long scar on his right cheek contributed to the look of disgust people gave to him, and this always made him feel bad. Not only that, his missing front tooth always caused the kids to run away from him, and every time it happened, he would close his mouth in shame. The missing tooth resulted from a fight he was involved in as a teenager. His angry opponent knocked it out with a big stick, and he had to live with it for the rest of his life. Mr. Bentley was the typical old beggar who would go around begging for food and water. Sometimes he would walk into grocery stores and beg for money. Because of his aged and fragile appearance, he was continuously talked down to and pushed around. One of the grocery stores he used to go to as a beggar took a picture of him and printed a large poster with a big red X sign in the middle. This meant he could no longer go into the shop or be seen around the premises. The day Mr. Bentley saw the poster, he was unfortunate. He had heard his other beggars talk about it, but he never believed them because he thought they were teasing him. Unlike his other beggars who lived with him, he was the most intelligent of them all. He was a naturally wise man. He could read and comprehend texts faster than the rest of them. He went to school once, but decided to drop out and hang out with his friends. One of his bad decisions. His mother warned him about the kind of company he kept and the kind of things they did, but he would not listen. He thought she wanted him to live a quiet and boring life like her, but in the end, he wished he listened to her. He knew his life would have been better if he only listened to her. He would live in his own house and have a family, not on the streets as a beggar. If he were not rich, he would be respected among his peers and not laughed at. And the residents of the road he lived on would not look at him with pity or send him away whenever he approached them for help. He regretted his actions, his fights with his mother, doing drugs, and being a heavy alcoholic at the most critical ages of his life. And lastly, he regretted going to prison. He feared more than anything to go back to prison. The horrible experiences he had there was something he would never want to have again. A week after he left prison, he moved from Vancouver to Toronto, where he would start on a fresh slate, and no one would recognize him. As expected, no one had come to take him when he left prison. While in prison, he learned his mother had died. and that's when his whole world crashed. He knew he was left alone in the world to care for himself. None of his uncles wanted anything to do with him, especially when he was old enough to have his own family. After he moved to Toronto, he tried to do small jobs, but no one wanted to hire him. He tried many places, but got the same response. And if at all the response he got was different, it would be that he didn't look fit for the job and they only needed younger people. After a long time of trying, he gave up and became a beggar on the street. He met with a small group of beggars who created a small space for him to sleep at night, and that's how everything started. One night, he was outside his small mansion trying to keep himself warm by the fire when he heard loud footsteps approaching him. At first, he thought it was two people arguing because of the sounds they made, but after listening closely, he realized they were trying to carry something heavy, and he could tell from how they walked. He wondered what the two men struggled to carry at such an odd hour. The last time he asked about the time, his neighbor Ray said it was 1 a.m. The whole neighborhood was quiet because everyone had retired to their homes, and aside from the men, he could only hear the distant sound of barking dogs. Out of curiosity, he put off the fire and walked in the direction the noise came from. He hid behind an old abandoned car and peeped at them through its window. The two men were arguing about something, but because of the angle he stood at, he could not see what they were trying to carry. He was careful not to announce his presence, or they would harm him. The two men were arguing in hushed tones, and in a bid for the one who looked like their leader to enforce his authority on the other man, he took off his mask. Right at that moment, Mr. Bentley recognized him. It was one of the men who lived down the street. He was popularly known as Big Jack because of his deep baritone voice and his giant-like nature. Big Jack was almost 6 feet 7 inches tall, and his muscular biceps contributed to his intimidating look. The second man, Mr. Bentley could not see his face, apologized immediately, and they continued carrying the heavy load. Being wise, he hid very well until they were out of sight. He returned to his tent when he could no longer hear their footsteps and voices. The following day, he was forcefully awakened by the loud, incessant chatters of people who lived in his neighborhood. It turned out that the thieves broke into the house of a rich man who was away on vacation, and they made away with his mini safe, which contained a lot of money and pieces of jewelry. Until that moment, Mr. Bentley did not know what the men took until he went to the scene. The police were already there, and many of his neighbors were there too. "Who could have possibly done this?" one of the women who stood close to him asked. She was talking to no one in particular, and no one answered. The front door of the victimized home was broken. This showed that they forcefully entered and came out through the back window, which explained how Mr. Bentley saw them. The rear window of the house they broke into directly faced the street he and the other beggars lived on. Later that day, no one talked about the incident anymore. He heard the owner returned to follow up on the case and was looking for anyone who heard or saw anything. Since he returned from prison a few years back, he was not ready to associate himself with any trouble or anything that could send him back. That night, another item was stolen from a different house this time around. And as if Mr. Bentley suspected something fishy would happen, he stayed up late. He was sitting by the fire, reflecting on his terrible life choices, when he heard a frantic movement. It happened so fast that he had no time to put off his fire. He sneaked to watch them again, but unfortunately, he was caught. He mistakenly kicked an empty beer can, pulling Big Jack's attention. As expected, Big Jack and his partner ran in the direction the sound came from and found him bending by the car. "What did you hear, old man?" Big Jack asked as he pulled him up by his coat and pushed him hard against the car. Nothing, he responded in a trembling voice. From the way his hands and legs shook, they could tell that he was afraid. The second man stood up for him and pleaded with Big Jack to let him go. Maybe that would have been the last time anyone saw him if he didn't. "If I let him go now, how are we sure that he will not snitch on us?" Big Jack asked as he pointed a small gun at him. Come on, Big Jack. If you pull the trigger, it will alert everyone and even the police. He tried to persuade Big Jack. And I'm sure you won't be so stupid to tell on us. Or would you? The second man asked, looking at Mr. Bentley. Mr. Bentley immediately shook his head to show he would not report them. But even at that, Big Jack insisted. Big Jack said he never loved Mr. Bentley because he reminded him of his late grumpy father who thought he could detect his life. Luckily for him, the second man gave him a lot of reasons killing Mr. Bentley could go wrong. It was a life-defining moment for Mr. Bentley when he heard two men deliberating on killing him or not. Before they left, they ordered him to close his eyes and sing his favorite song. He thought he was going to die, but by the time he opened his eyes, they were gone. He struggled to sleep the rest of the night, but he kept remembering everything that happened and how he narrowly escaped death. The following day, another crowd gathered, but it was not just the police. An ambulance came to take a badly injured lady. It turned out that the house Big Jack and his partner robbed was the home of Sarah Malvin, a young woman in her 30s who lived with her mother and son. Sarah and her mother were the only ones who treated him nicely and cared for him. Last Christmas, they gave him 2 winter coats, a basket of beverages, and a plate of homemade food. Unlike the other kids, her son would occasionally smile and wave at him whenever he was with his mother. When Mr. Bentley found out it was her, he felt evil. Thieves also made away with a family heirloom necklace worth thousands of dollars, making Sarah very unhappy. While Mr. Bentley stood with the other passerby outside the house, Sarah spotted him and walked to him. At first, he wanted to walk away when he saw her looking at him, but it was already too late. She walked to him and hugged him, then cried on his shoulder. Everyone was surprised, including him. No one had hugged him in a long time, and especially not with the way he looked. He felt evil, but could not say anything because he was afraid Big Jack would kill him. I wish there was someone out there who saw them. Now I have to start saving for Michael's education. And that's great, being that I'm his only parent, Sarah said as she cried. Mr. Bentley knew she was being sarcastic, and he knew how demanding it was to be a single mother, because a single mother himself raised him. I know who broke in. I saw them, Mr. Bentley said. When she looked up, he could see the surprise and ray of hope in Sarah's eyes. Her face was already red from crying. You do? She asked to be sure. Yes, but you must promise me you will protect me, or they will kill me. Sarah nodded and wiped her tears. She called the policeman who was asking people questions, and he came. Are you sure about what you just said? The policeman asked after he had written his statement. Okay then, you'll have to come with us to the station, he added. Mr. Bentley looked at Sarah again, and she nodded. Entering the police car brought memories, but he did an excellent job suppressing them. While at the station, he went through a series of questions again, and he told them everything he saw and heard. Are you sure you did not break into her home yourself? One of the police officers at the station asked him. Mr. Bentley was shocked at the question. He did not expect them to try and pin it on him. No, why would I want to do that? He tried to defend himself, but the policeman was not listening. I don't know, you tell me. Or maybe it's because we ran your name through our database and it says you served in prison for several crimes, including breaking. When he heard this, he froze in fear. His heart began beating fast. Tell me why we should not put you behind bars right now, the man asked again. Because I did not do it, and... You know, that's what old thieves like you do. You commit a crime, then blame it on another so we do not see the real you. And do not think that being old is the reason you'll go off the hook, the policeman cut in. When Mr. Bentley was about to respond, Big Jack and his partner walked in with their hands cuffed behind their backs. Big Jack had a blood stain on the arm part of his t-shirt. The police said he started firing at them when he saw them. When Big Jack saw Mr. Bentley, he frowned at him, and out of anger, he used his head to break his partner's nose violently. This alone caused the officer to put them in different cells. After a couple of questioning, the police released him to Sarah, who came to take him home. The stolen items were recovered and given back to the owners. Sarah could not stop thanking Mr. Bentley, and in return, she asked him to move in with them so they could take care of him. Mr. Bentley was happy to hear that because he was tired of living on the street and having no family. He agreed and moved in with them, and a couple of weeks later, he transformed into a different and healthy man. Michael, Sarah's son, became his best friend, and they always played together. Oscar was a reticent boy and was often teased at school, mostly because of the fact that he looked like a girl. He had pretty facial features, tenderness, calmness of voice, compliance, eternal anxiety, and this was what Oscar hated in himself. He lived in a small town where almost everyone knew everything about each other. There was a deep forest nearby, through which he often went to school, avoiding the school bus. He didn't like buses because of the bullies, and he dreamed of his own skateboard. The people in town did not like the Oscar's family either. It was all because of his father, who was an obsessive kleptomaniac. He would steal people's wallets, food, and even small furniture from their houses. Also, he was an alcoholic, because of which he would often involve in fights. Many teachers compared Oscar to his father, although he was completely different. Students in school would often call him names and set him up, throwing things at him. His clumsiness, modesty, and old shabby clothes were the topics for their ridicules. Long and lean body, red hair, freckles, and black eyes exacerbated the situation. His classmates would laugh at him, calling him a tiny red rat. Over time, Oscar himself began to feel like a rat, as if imitating the habits of this animal. He even became interested in biology and zoology, which described the behavior of various animals. A lowered look and a quick, clumsy gait amused his peers. They would trip the boy, throw small stones and food at, tore his clothes, spat, and even punched him in the stomach sometimes. There was the main bully in school named Duke, who was the leader of the entire school, including Oscar's class. He was famous for having a lot of money and for being the son of a very influential person. His dad often defended his son, paying him off with cash. Humiliating and beating Oscar was Duke's daily job. The whole class, as if under hypnosis, obeyed their notorious leader. Every day, Oscar suffered another attack from a pack of wild hyenas. Yes, Oscar compared them to hyenas. A regular holiday for him was considered the day when he was humiliated just verbally, without usage of physical force. One day, Oscar stopped attending school after Duke and his gang tore his new shirt, which his mother had bought with the last of her money. And because of the numerous blows, his body was covered with bluish bruises. The house in which the boy lived was old, the roof often leaked during heavy rains, and some household appliances did not work at all. There was little food for them to eat, and because of it, his sister and Oscar were skinny. Oscar's family was dysfunctional. It consisted of a mother and his 4 younger sisters. His father committed suicide after he learned he would have a boy. His mom worked several jobs to provide for her daughters and for Oscar. All the boy's clothes were in patches, which his mother carefully sewed. But even these patches managed to be torn off by his daily enemies. Skipping his classes, Oscar loved to sit in the woods on the soft moss and read romance books. He always dreamed of a real-life relationship with a girl. No one would cut off his dreams on soft like a cloud of moss. But suddenly he heard a low, vile chuckle. Turning around, he saw Duke's gang heading towards him. Oscar realized that Duke had a shiny, sharp knife in his hand. He wanted to run away, but it was too late. They surrounded Oscar from all sides, leaving him no chance to escape. After tearing all his clothes off and his favorite book to shreds, they almost completed their crime, having made a deep, sharp cut on the right pale arm. They left completely naked Oscar alone in the darkening forest. The predators fled, uttering incomprehensible cries. Oscar was in terrible pain and not well physically at all. He wept bitterly. A weak, skinny boy whose body was like a wounded doe lay in a ball on the fluffy moss. Crimson blood flew endlessly from his paresis. He lay in the cold, covered with the remains of his torn clothes, and did not think of returning home. But the advancing twilight forced the boy to get up and leave the dark forest. Oscar's mother greeted him with hugs and cried loudly. He didn't have any more clothes for the next day. A patched blue shirt, thin trousers, black old-worn shoes. That's all he had up to the moment. His mom got some clothes for him in a thrift store, but Oscar did not want to return to school, so later on, his mother decided to transfer him to homeschooling. Over time, Oscar became a grown-up, but his courage did not increase. He still remained gentle and fragile. In addition to everything, he feared visiting public places, as there was a high probability of meeting with Duke's gang. But Oscar never stopped dreaming about love. The guy worked part-time in the nearest library as a janitor. The saved money could be spent on his college education. He helped his sisters as much as possible, trying to bring the dwelling into a suitable condition. The grown-up guy tried to get acquainted with social networks, but all his attempts were in vain. One day, he received a message from a girl named Kelly. They began to communicate with a hint of a relationship. Over several months of their communication, their virtual friendship only grew stronger. Suddenly, there were some feelings sparkled between Oscar and Kelly. The emotions that overwhelmed Oscar were so strong that he decided to meet her in person. The city where Kelly lived was just as small as his, but the people in it were more balanced towards each other and didn't know Oscar. They met each other and soon they got married. They began to live together in a small house, which they rented with the money they earned. Oscar tried to make gifts, although they were not expensive, but the girl's eyes would light up even from them. This brought them some kind of exceptional emotional saturation in their relationship. Their love was reasonable and built on a solid friendship. She was his right hand in all aspects of their life. They knew each other's shortcomings and tried to deal with the difficulties along the way. Overcoming his fears, Oscar became stronger and stronger every day. From a skinny, clumsy boy, he grew into a stately, handsome one. Kelly was his true muse. Thanks to her, he found a good job and became self-confident. But some inner fears remained still. Oscar was afraid of guys and stout men who reminded him of the bully Duke. Kelly had the same personality as Oscar. She was gentle, shy, and fragile. At their first meeting, Oscar understood it and decided to start changing for good. Oscar would never stop to admire Kelly. She was a real example for him. Every time he would go crazy with her brown curly hair, smile, voice, and laughter. Even her sadness and mood swings seemed to Oscar as something native, beautiful. He supported and comforted her as much as he could. They complemented each other perfectly. Separately they were weak, but together they formed a whole universe. Kelly suggested getting a small tattoo in place of a scar from the sharp knife that Oscar received as a child. His new tattoo was sun-shaped, symbolizing a new bright stage in his life. Kelly dreamed of children, and Oscar hated them. From his school years, he had a trauma associated with his peers. He experienced a particular dislike for children, which later grew into a terrible phobia. Oscar was sure that he would be a bad example for children. He feared they would become as unhappy and weak as him. Kelly was already a mature girl with a good job and a house she bought with Oscar. She wanted to experience maternal feelings, but Oscar was categorically against it. She tried to convince him that he would be a good father, but Oscar did not want to accept it. Kelly and Oscar soon began to have disagreements because of the children. As a result, Oscar had a serious quarrel and decided to end their relationship with his lover. After separation, and due to the death of his mother, Oscar had to visit the city of his childhood. But now, he was no longer afraid to go out. He no longer hid in the forest as he did when he was a child. He even found out that the fates of those guys who bullied him in childhood were terrible. Duke's wealthy father was imprisoned for fraud, and the guy himself began abusing alcohol and drugs, leading to health problems and subsequent amputation of his limbs. Other classmates who also bullied Oscar under Duke's command lived very poorly. Their fate was typical. They got married, had many kids, and low-paying jobs. Their unfortunate lives were discussed in the small town. Oscar stopped being afraid of those guys. He even began to feel better than them. Indeed, he was handsome and self-sufficient. But now, His flaw was his endless sadness. He forgave the bully from childhood, but now he couldn't forget his love. Every day he would feel guilty about the quarrel that had happened with Kelly last time. Time passed, and he did not want to start a new relationship. Kelly was a goddess for him. He constantly thought only of her. He realized that he had acted foolishly. He was ready to change drastically and accept his foolishness, but he thought it might be too late, and his guilt might have brought the final verdict in their relationship. He didn't want to disturb Kelly, thinking she hated him. Suddenly, his phone rang. An unexpected call interrupted Oscar's sadness. It was Kelly on the phone. She began to sob bitterly, saying that she was ready to live with, even if it would cost her to live without having kids. Simultaneous thoughts reunited them. They were ready to trade for each other. Oscar now wanted to try being a father for Kelly's sake. They always felt each other as if some invisible thread connected them. Soon, Kelly became pregnant and gave birth to a boy, and a year later to another girl. After their children's birth, Oscar became even more fond of Kelly. He had solid fatherly feelings. He was ready to become more sociable for the sake of his children. And indeed, the love and care of both parents made it possible to raise healthy and intelligent children. Oscar felt warm and calm for the first time when he saw that his children began to make friends and actively communicate with each other. He often walked with his children and devoted all his free time to them. Although it was difficult for him to make it in society, he still tried to make their life happier and more colorful. Oscar began to communicate more with the children's fathers in school, went to football matches, and visited art galleries. That's how he started making friends. He was often complimented about his empathy, that he could understand almost any person to provide emotional support. His self-confidence grew each time. Soon, Oscar had a strong desire to communicate more and attend various events. As an adult man, Oscar understood he was a good father. He had a good, loving wife and worthy friends, and his past path was only an experience that helped him to understand himself and those around.